What happens when Hollywood's most beloved narrator meets a talk show host who thinks he's untouchable? The night that Morgan Freeman walked onto Jimmy Kimmel's stage was supposed to be a routine promotional appearance, but it turned into one of the most shocking confrontations in late-night television history. Before we dive into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us what you think really happened that night. The studio audience was buzzing with excitement as Morgan Freeman made his entrance, that familiar warm smile lighting up his face as he waved to the crowd. At 78 years old, Freeman had seen it all in Hollywood, from his early days struggling as an actor to becoming one of the most recognizable voices in cinema. He'd been, through countless interviews, handled difficult questions with grace, and never once lost his composure on camera. Tonight would be different. Jimmy Kimmel bounded onto the stage with his usual exaggerated enthusiasm, the kind that made some guests feel welcomed and others feel like they were being mocked. He'd built his career on a particular brand of humor that often walked the line between clever and cruel, and tonight he seemed especially energetic. The producers had briefed him on Freeman's latest project, a documentary about social justice that had been generating serious buzz in Hollywood circles. As Freeman settled into the guest chair, adjusting his suit jacket with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this thousands of times, Kimmel launched into his opening monologue segment. The audience laughed at his jokes about current events, but Freeman's expression remained neutral, politely attentive, but not particularly amused. This should have been Kimmel's first warning sign. The formal interview began smoothly enough. Kimmel asked about Freeman's latest film, complimenting his legendary voice and making the usual jokes about how Freeman could make reading a grocery list sound profound. Freeman responded with his characteristic eloquence, speaking thoughtfully about his craft and the importance of storytelling in cinema. The audience hung on every word, clearly in awe of the man who had narrated some of their favorite documentaries and delivered unforgettable performances in countless films. But then Kimmel's tone shifted. Perhaps it was the way Freeman had politely deflected one of his jokes, or maybe it was simply the host's need to assert dominance over his guest, but something changed in Kimmel's demeanor. His smile became more forced, his questions more pointed. He began interrupting Freeman mid-sentence, something that visibly irritated the veteran actor, though he maintained his composure. The first real sign of trouble came when Kimmel brought up Freeman's documentary about social justice. Instead of asking thoughtful questions about the subject matter, Kimmel launched into what could only be described as a lecture, dismissing the film's premise with a wave of his hand and suggesting that Freeman didn't really understand the complexities of modern social issues. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing that something was wrong. Freeman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, but his voice remained steady as he tried to redirect the conversation back to the actual content of his work. He spoke about the months of research that had gone into the documentary, the experts he'd interviewed, and the personal stories that had moved him to tears during filming. But Kimmel wasn't listening. He was too busy preparing his next attack. The host leaned back in his chair with a smirk that the audience couldn't see, but Freeman could, and began what would later be described by witnesses as a character assassination, disguised as comedy. He questioned Freeman's motives, suggested that the actor was only involved in social justice causes for publicity, and made several comments that bordered on personal attacks. The studio audience, who had come expecting laughs and light entertainment, found themselves watching something that felt more like a public humiliation. Freeman's hands gripped the armrests of his chair, and for the first time in decades of public appearances, his famous composure began to crack. The man who had played God in movies, who had narrated the story of the universe itself, was being treated like an amateur by a host who seemed to have forgotten that respect is earned, not demanded. The tension in the studio was palpable, with crew members exchanging worried glances and the audience sitting in stunned silence. What happened next would be talked about in Hollywood for months to come. Freeman slowly turned in his chair to face Kimmel directly, his eyes narrowing as he prepared to respond to the host's increasingly aggressive behavior. The legendary actor who had spent his entire career maintaining his dignity in the face of adversity was about to show America what happens when you push a good man too far. Freeman's voice, when he finally spoke, carried a weight that seemed to silence even the air conditioning in the studio. It wasn't the warm, grandfatherly tone that audiences were accustomed to from his films, but something harder, more authoritative. The voice of a man who had earned his respect through decades of hard work, and wasn't about to let some talk show host diminish his legacy. "Jimmy," Freeman said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade, "I've been in this business for over 50 years. I've worked with directors who screamed at actors, producers who treated people like garbage, and executives who thought their money made them gods. But I've never, in all my years, sat across from someone who so clearly disrespects not just his guests, but his own audience." The studio fell into a silence so complete that the camera operators could be heard adjusting their equipment. Kimmel's smile faltered for the first time, his usual quick wit seemingly abandoned, as he realized he might have pushed too far. But Freeman wasn't finished. "You brought me here tonight to talk about my work, about a project that means something to me and to the people whose stories I'm helping to tell. Instead, you've turned this into some kind of performance where you're the star and I'm just a prop for your ego." Freeman's words were measured, deliberate, each one landing with the precision of someone who understood the power of language. Kimmel tried to laugh it off, attempting to regain control of his own show with a joke about Freeman being too serious and needing to lighten up. It was exactly the wrong thing to say. The audience, who had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with their host's behavior, began to murmur their disapproval. Some even started to boo, a sound that rarely, if ever, echoed through Kimmel's studio. Freeman stood up slowly, his tall frame commanding attention even in the bright lights of the television studio. "You know what the difference is between you and me, Jimmy? I've spent my career trying to elevate people, to tell stories that matter, to use whatever platform I've been given to make the world a little bit better. You've spent yours tearing people down for laughs." The host's face flushed. Red, whether from embarrassment or anger, wasn't clear, but his response revealed everything about his character. Instead of apologizing or trying to salvage the situation with grace, Kimmel doubled down. He accused Freeman of being sanctimonious and suggested that the actor's reputation was built more on publicity than talent. The words hung in the air, like poison, and even some of the crew members looked shocked at their boss's behavior. Freeman shook his head slowly, the disappointment clear on his face. "I've met a lot of people in this industry who confused fame with importance, who thought that having a platform meant they could say whatever they wanted without consequences. But you, Jimmy, you've confused cruelty with comedy, and that's something I won't be a part of." The audience was now openly expressing their displeasure with Kimmel's conduct, some calling out for him to apologize, others simply booing every time he tried to speak. The host, clearly rattled by the turn of events, made one final attempt to regain control by suggesting that Freeman was being dramatic and should sit down and finish the interview like a professional. It was the breaking point. Freeman's eyes flashed with something that the audience had never seen from the beloved actor, a cold fury that spoke to decades of dealing with people who thought their position gave them the right to be disrespectful. "Professional?" Freeman repeated, his voice now carrying the full weight of his authority. "Let me show you what professional looks like." Freeman began to remove his lapel microphone with careful, deliberate movements, his actions speaking louder than any words could. The studio audience watched in fascination as one of Hollywood's most respected figures prepared to do something that would be talked about for years to come. Kimmel, perhaps finally realizing the magnitude of his mistake, tried desperately to salvage the situation. "Come on, Morgan, don't be like that. It's just television, it's just jokes. The audience loves this stuff." But his words sounded hollow even to himself. The audience clearly didn't love what they were seeing. They had come to see their hero, Morgan Freeman, not to watch him be humiliated by a host who had forgotten that respect is a two-way street. Freeman finished removing his microphone and placed it carefully on the small table between the two chairs. His movements were controlled, dignified, everything that Kimmel's behavior had not been. The actor looked directly into the camera, speaking not to his host but to the millions of viewers who would eventually see this footage. To everyone watching at home, Freeman said, his voice now carrying the full gravitas that had made him one of the most trusted narrators in Hollywood. I want you to remember something. Respect isn't given because someone has a television show, or because they can make people laugh. Respect is earned through how you treat others, especially when you think nobody is watching. The camera caught every word, every nuance of Freeman's expression, as he delivered what would become one of the most quoted moments in late-night television history. Behind him, Kimmel sat frozen, clearly understanding that he was witnessing the destruction of his own reputation in real time. Freeman turned back to Kimmel one final time, and what he said next would haunt the host for months to come. Jimmy, you had the opportunity tonight to have a real conversation with someone who has lived through history, someone who could have shared stories that might have inspired your audience. Instead, you chose to be small. You chose to make this about your ego instead of about the people watching at home who deserved better. The studio audience erupted in applause, a standing ovation that lasted nearly 2 full minutes. Crew members, who rarely showed emotion during tapings, could be seen nodding in approval, and some even joined the applause. The sound was deafening, a clear indication of where the room's sympathies lay. Kimmel, desperate to salvage something from the wreckage of his show, stood up and tried to approach Freeman with his hand extended, presumably for a conciliatory handshake. But Freeman simply looked at the outstretched hand, then back at Kimmel's face, and shook his head slowly. The rejection was polite but absolute, and it spoke volumes about the character of both men. I've been disrespected before, Jimmy, but never so publicly and never so deliberately. The sad thing is, you don't even understand what you've done here tonight. You think this is just another segment, just another celebrity you can push around for content. But what you've shown everyone, here is who you really are when you think you have power over someone. Freeman began walking toward the exit, his stride confident and unhurried despite the chaos erupting around him. Security personnel, unsure of protocol in such an unprecedented situation, looked between their boss and the departing guest, ultimately deciding to simply stay out of the way. Kimmel, now visibly panicking as he watched his show disintegrate before his eyes, called out after Freeman, "Morgan, please, let's start over. We can edit this, we can make this work." But his voice cracked with desperation, and the audience could hear every word through his still active microphone. Freeman paused at the edge of the stage, just before the curtain that would take him backstage and away from the cameras. He turned back one final time, and what he said next would be replayed on social media millions of times in the coming weeks. Jimmy, the cameras are rolling. Your audience is watching. Everyone in this studio can see exactly what kind of person you choose to be when you think you're in control. You can edit the show, but you can't edit your character. And tonight you've shown everyone exactly what that character looks like. With that, Morgan Freeman walked off the stage of Jimmy Kimmel Live, leaving behind a stunned audience, a humiliated host, and what would become one of the most talked-about moments in television history. The remaining crew scrambled to figure out how to fill the rest of the show's time slot, while Kimmel stood alone on his stage, finally experiencing the silence that comes when respect is lost and dignity is abandoned. The audience continued to applaud Freeman's exit long after he had disappeared behind the curtain, their message clear to anyone who cared to listen. They had come to see a legend, and they had witnessed exactly that, but not in the way anyone had expected. They had seen what happens when integrity meets arrogance, when earned respect faces hollow authority, and when a man who has spent his life lifting others up encounters someone who has built his career tearing people down. The studio eventually fell silent, but the impact of that night would resonate far beyond the walls of the television studio. It was a reminder that, in a world where platforms can be bought and fame can be manufactured, true respect must still be earned, and that sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is simply walking away with your dignity intact. What did you think of Morgan Freeman's incredible response to being disrespected on live television? Drop a comment below and let us know if you think he handled this situation the right way. And don't forget to subscribe for more shocking celebrity moments that you won't believe actually happened.